Hey there, everyone. Pastor John here with our next lesson in our series, Becoming Methodist Again. And in this series, we've been looking back at the early practices and beliefs of the Methodists under John Wesley. And we've been looking at rebuilding our faith, our identity, and our mission as Christians within the Methodist movement. And so in this series, the very first lesson we looked at was how our mission to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world is not going particularly well in the United States. And then we looked at how we could become more effective in our mission. And a suggestion that I made was that becoming more like the early Methodists, which is really becoming more like the early church, could be a good step for us in re-engaging effectively in the mission that God has given us in the world. And so in order to become Methodist again, we identified 6 pillars that we need to rebuild. We looked at how we need to become Bible Christians, how we need to know, be transformed by, and proclaim the gospel. We looked at how we need to be people of prayer. Last week, we looked at the need to worship the Lord and how that can help us be a transformational people. And now today, we're going to look at social action. So this is that next pillar, social action. And for our purposes today, we're defining social action in this way. Different people might define it a different way, but I think this is a good working definition for us. This is one I just kind of came up with from the way I've been thinking about this area of the series. And social action is meeting the tangible needs of others through direct action and or through influencing society and legislative processes. So it's basically any action that we take individually or as a church in the world, which is directly helping people. So like serving at the way or volunteering at Safer or, just helping somebody who's in need on the street or in the community, or then also advocating at, say, community meetings or writing a letter to your representative, using your voice to help shape society and legislation so that people can have their needs met and live a more whole and fulfilled life. So that's the definition of social action that we're working with for today's lesson. Now, this is just an outline of where we're going with this definition in mind. We're going to look at Wesley's context, the context in which he took social action in the 18th century England. We're going to look at Wesley's theology of social action. We're going to look at his personal actions. So if he has a high theology, what did he actually do in his life? And then we're going to look at the social action of the early Methodists in general as a movement. We're going to look at this really cool example of Methodist social action called the Foundry. This is awesome. And then we're going to look at the fruit of Methodist action. So what impact did this actually have in the society of England overall? So first, we're going to look at the context of 18th century England. And what we're going to see, and what we have seen when you research this, is that in 18th century England, this is all happening during the Industrial Revolution, there was a new class of urban poor. So people are coming into the cities to work at factories. They're finding themselves to be very poor. And the upper class in England is relatively unsympathetic to this for the most part, seeing the working poor as kind of part of the machinery of this Industrial Revolution, making affluence possible for everybody else. And so there's not a whole lot of care being extended to the working poor in the cities. Another complicating factor is that there is the invention of distilleries. So different kinds of alcohol are being created, which is putting a strain on barley because they're using barley to create the alcohol. And so with just basic supply and demand, what's happening here is all the barley is being bought up by these distilleries. There's therefore less bread to go to people. And when demand stays the same or goes up and supply goes down, what happens is prices go up. And so price for bread became just astronomical during this time. So people couldn't afford bread. As a result, there were regular riots in England during this time over food shortages and working conditions. So England was in a very bad spot. In fact, some historians think that England was ripe for an event similar to the French Revolution, with everything that was happening in England at the time. So with all that being said, obviously it's a very volatile and difficult context that Wesley's entering into. What is his theology of social action? Why was it important? How did he look at it? Well, he saw social action as a necessary fruit of discipleship overall. Like, if you're going to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, then you need to love and care for others. End of story. Like, full stop. That's what Wesley believed. If you look at it, he believed it was a necessary part of loving your neighbor. What does Jesus say, after all, is the greatest commandment? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And you can't love your neighbor as yourself unless you're helping your neighbor, right? You can't just say, oh, I love you, and then not do anything about it, because that just shows you don't care, right? I mean, think about it in our own personal relationships. If you tell your spouse or your child or a friend that you love them, but then you never actually do anything tangible to show your love, after a while, they're not going to believe you. Love compels action. And so what Wesley is saying, if we truly love our neighbor the way that Christ calls us to, it's going to take action, and we're going to be helping people. Similarly, under the sort of broader heading of discipleship, social action is a part of growing in personal holiness. Holiness gets such a bad rap in our day and age. We think of people who are holier than thou, or we imagine, people who are, just really uptight. But holiness means to be like Jesus. Holiness means to have the character of Christ. And as we're seeking to become more like Christ, what will we then become? When we look at Jesus, how did he live? He was generous toward people he need, right? He helped people. He loved people, especially people on the margins, especially people who made mistakes, especially people who were in need and who other people would overlook. And so as we grow in personal holiness, then we are called to love and care for people just the way Jesus did. And part of that growth, Wesley really emphasized that, like, his time was not his own, his talents were not his own, his money was not his own. Everything he was and had was a gift to him from God. In fact, he would keep a journal where he would look at how effectively he was using his time, and he'd record like his activities down to like a quarter hour, so he could reflect back and see how he could use his time more efficiently, because he knew it wasn't his time, but it was time that had been given to him by God to bless others and glorify the Lord. And that's all under that growing in holiness, right? That perspective of seeing, I'm not my own, but I've been bought with a price, and taking on more of the mind of Christ. So under the broader heading that social action flows from discipleship, Wesley saw that social action was a necessary fruit of loving your neighbor, a necessary fruit of growing in holiness and becoming more like Jesus, and then also part of joining in God's mission of restoration, right? If God is on a mission to save sinners, to be sure, but then also to restore all of creation and establish his perfect kingdom, where all that is wrong is put right, then, and he's called his church and empowered his church to carry out that mission, then Wesley saw, wait a second, we're called to go into the world and be a force for restoration. We're called to take that which is wrong and put right. And obviously, people not having enough food, people laboring in unfair and unjust conditions are things that are wrong, which need to be righted. And so he saw the church stepping into the public square and helping the needy, and personally, and then through shaping society and legislation as part of God's mission of restoration. So he had a very high theology of social action. And he really believed that the church could make progress. He really believed that the church could, in fact, improve people's lives. The church could, in fact, transform society and shape legislation, because we're not just doing this of our own accord, or because we feel like it's the right thing to do, or because we feel as though we have some moral obligation. We're actually joining in God's mission. It's not about us. It's about us joining in God's mission to share his love as we grow in our personal holiness, and to be a part of his plan of restoration in the world. So he had a high theology of social action. He was very much behind it, and believed that the Lord could actually make it possible. And then as we look at this, I love this. This is one of the general rules for Methodists, that they would follow, what they would seek to do, in the way they would try to order their lives. They were to seek to go about and be doing good by being in every kind merciful after their power as they have opportunity, doing good of every possible sort and as is possible to all men, to their bodies, to the ability which God giveth, by giving food to the hungry, by clothing the naked, by visiting and helping them that are sick or in prison, to their souls by instructing, reproving, or exhorting all. So this has been simplified now to do all the good you can by all the means you can and all the ways you can and all the places you can and all the times you can to all the people you can as long as you can. It's just about doing good, helping people, showing God's love and holiness and being a part of that plan of restoration in every possible way. That was what the Methodists, John Wesley and the Methodists, were committed to. Now, this is a very high calling. Obviously, I fully agree with this calling. I think this is a very biblical way of looking at this. Question is, does Wesley's life live up to what he's espousing? Is he practicing what he's preaching? That is the question for us next. There you go. Wesley practiced what he preached. Now, how did he do that? He practiced what he preached. First of all, this might not seem like a big deal, but I think it really is. He did not wear a powdered wig. You're thinking, what's that about? Why is that a big deal? A powdered wig was a sign of status. It meant you were a gentleman. It meant you were part of respectable society. It meant you were better than other people, basically. And so Wesley, even though, his dad was a priest, and so there was a little bit of social standing there, even though he went to Oxford, was ordained clergy, so there's some standing there. He's very well educated, very well spoken, certainly has access to means, although he did not always avail himself of all the money that was available to him. We'll see that in a moment. And could have been considered part of high society. He did not wear a powdered wig because he wanted to identify with the poor. He wanted to identify with the needy. And so just by the way he dressed, he was showing himself to identify with and seek to support the poor and the oppressed by not wearing the powdered wig, which would have been common for someone in his station at that time. So I think that's a little thing, but it's a way he would have stuck out socially. You can imagine the other clergy, many clergy, including actually his brother Charles, wore powdered wigs, and you can imagine, look at him, you're not fitting in, you're not wearing what everyone else is wearing. And he did that, and I'm sure he would have stuck out and caught some flack for it. But again, he did that to show his solidarity with the poor. And then he also literally put his money where his mouth was on this. He did, make a good income. His income went up over the course of his life, especially as his books and writings sold. But he gave it all away. He basically lived on the same amount his whole life. He lived on about 30 pounds a year and always sought to give away more every year. It's estimated that he gave away 32,000 pounds over his lifetime, which we don't have a whole lot of way of rationalizing that. But in one of the books that I was reading, so there's a very prolific Wesley biographer who estimates that over his lifetime, that 32,000 pounds converted to today would be like giving away $1.5 million over your lifetime, which, to put it in perspective, if you gave away, I crunched the numbers on this. If you gave away about $570 a week for 50 years, that would be $1.5 million. So he's given away a lot of money. Obviously, he wasn't able to give, that's not the way he did it. His giving went up over his life because as he got older and was more renowned and sold more books and things, he had more income to give away. So a lot of that giving, at least in terms of total amount, was probably on the back end, but he gave a substantial amount, again, living on basically 30 pounds his entire life. And his general approach toward money was gain all you can, save all you can, and give all you can. He saw nothing wrong with making a good profit and with making a good wage and saving money, but he also believed that you should be giving and helping people who are in need. And so that's the way he lived his life. And as we'll see in a moment, he died with basically nothing. And he counted as rich anyone who had food and raiment for himself, so basically, the basics, and for their family without running into debt, something over. So, you're not starving, you don't have debt, you got a little left over for some incidentals here and there. That's who he counted to be rich. Think about that. Think about how often we need the next this or that. Oh, I need a new car. Oh, I need a new iPad. Oh, I need a new house. I need a new this, a new that. And then we never feel like we're rich. We never feel like we have enough, even though we are absurdly wealthy, even the poorest among us in comparison with humans who have come before us or people around the world. And Wesley, the way he's defining rich is anyone who has the basics, essentially. Like you can eat, you've got essentials, and you're not in debt, and you got a little bit left over, for a rainy day. And that's the way he lived. When he died, that's what he had. He didn't have debt. a little something left over, just enough basically to cover final expenses. Kind of close out his affairs, bury him, all that sort of stuff, and that was it. That was his estate. He had given everything else away over his lifetime. Now, what did the early Methodists do? So we've seen, we're looking at with social action, Wesley's theology of social action, the way he personally lived. What did the Methodists do overall? A ton. I mean, they just did so much to help society. We see that they opened dispensaries, which are places where people could get medical care, medicine, find a place of refuge. They opened credit unions so people would have access to some funds. They started schools. They opened orphanages. They supported each other spiritually, emotionally, and materially through society and class meetings. So they're helping people outside their movement, just the general public with all those things I've already listed. And then when they would meet together in their class meetings, society meetings, not only would they pray for each other and encourage each other, spiritually and otherwise, but then they're also meeting each other's needs. I mean, you can see a group of people sitting around and someone saying, I need some prayer. Got laid off at the factory, and we're not quite sure how we're going to pay the rent this month. And someone else, in the group raised their hand and said, hey, I actually just got a raise, and I wasn't quite sure, what I was going to do with this little bit of extra income. I could help you out until you get back on your feet and cover rent for you for a month or two. And so you could just you can just imagine the way that's working out. And it's amazing how they were able to support each other within their groups, within their societies as a community. And they also sought to not just meet needs directly, but they also sought to influence society to care for the poor through preaching and teaching. So this is something Wesley would talk a lot about. He would advocate for the needs of the poor and the oppressed. He would also influence the government. He would write letters and written appeals and try to get legislation changed, perhaps most notably in Wesley and the Methodist movement overall, their opposition of slavery. In fact, one of Wesley's final letters was written to William Wilberforce, the man who would eventually influence Parliament to make slavery illegal. And Wesley's one of his final letters was him encouraging William Wilberforce to stay the course and overthrow slavery. So these are all ways, both direct and indirect, that Methodism was seeking to take part in social action in England and really live out the gospel. Now, I include this in here because it's a great microcosm of all that we've seen. It's just a great tangible example. So there's a place in England that really became a base of operations in London for the Methodists. It's called the Foundry. It was a former cannon factory that Wesley leased and renovated and used for his ministry center. He started this in 1739. And within the Foundry, there was a galleried chapel that could hold up to 1,500 people. So they'd have large gatherings of preaching and large worship services. Another room that could fit about 300 people. So other prayer meetings or talks, or they'd also eat meals together. And something that's worth noting here too, which is just indicative of all that we've seen so far, is there was no special dining hall for those who were like the big wigs. So if John and Charles Wesley wanted to talk over the course of a meal, and they were going to invite George Whitefield or a member of Parliament, if they're going to have William Wilberforce down to talk about something over a meal. I mean, who knows how much that happened? You would presume things like that probably happened. And they were going to have conversations over a meal. They didn't eat somewhere else than the main dining room with everybody else, even the poor who were being fed. They would all eat together in the same dining room. There was no VIP section, which I love. They're all in there together. So again, there's another dispensary in the Foundry. There was a book room, so a place where people could have access to books. There was a free school for up to 60 kids at a time. There was a shelter for widows. 66 class meetings started meeting there. Again, these are the real discipleship meetings, class meetings, the real core foundation of the Methodist movement. And then there were 2 weekly prayer meetings, and Wesley or one of his preachers would speak at them at 5 o'clock in the morning each time. So there's just a lot going, or every day rather, at 5 a.m. There was always speaking and praying and service all happening on within the Foundry. I think this is just such a great example for what our churches could be. I mean, that's really what the Foundry was. It was almost like a local church where there was worship and there was small groups meeting, and there's kids being cared for and educated, and there's elderly, and there's widows taking shelter, and there's meals being given out. I mean, it's just holistic. There's the preaching of God's word, there's discipleship, there's care for the poor and needy, all taking place under one roof. It's just a beautiful picture, and it's what the early Methodists were able to do. It's a great example for us to follow. So now, what do we see as the fruit of Methodist social action? Tremendous fruit. So they caused the upper class to care for the poor. So they really pulled on the heartstrings of the upper class and said, these people are humans, and caused them to care more about the poor and the needy. They also gave self-esteem, opportunity, and care to the poor. And so they showed the poor, they showed them their value as people. Said, no, you're not just cogs in a machine to serve the rich. You are loved by God, and we're going to show you respect, and we're going to care for you, and we're going to educate you. They would always give people Bibles and teach people to read. What a gift that would have been, still is, but especially in that day and age where not as many people could read, to teach people to read. What a gift. What an opportunity for upward mobility to all of a sudden be able to read. So they would give people opportunity, they care for people, give them food and medicine, and so they would care for the poor and show them they were worthy of affection and could have a future. And they transformed the character of society as a whole. I mean, it's just amazing the changes that happened. Problems with alcoholism went down. People regularly started actually observing the Sabbath and taking a day off. Legislation became more humane. Big changes in England as a result of the Methodist movement. And again, many historians will credit the Methodists with helping to stave off a French Revolution type event in England, which they think may have happened if the Methodists hadn't done their good work there. So this is just a picture of Methodist social action, looking at all that Wesley and the early Methodists did in the public sphere, so to speak. Obviously, we'll be talking more about application for this on Sunday. That's really what Sunday is about, seeing from the scriptures and applying it to the life of our congregations. But it's something that we need to take very seriously and consider personally and within our church. Are we following the biblical call, the call of Christ as disciples to love and care for our neighbor? Are we doing that? Are we living that out? And then we have such a great heritage and great example from Wesley and the early Methodists for doing that. And are we drawing on the best of our own tradition to carry that out too? It's sobering to think about for myself personally, but I'm excited. I'm excited for all that God can do through His Spirit in us and through our community to make a difference in the world and to see the world restored as the gospel and His kingdom are preached and then also shown in tangible ways. So I hope that this lesson has been helpful to you and helped you understand a little bit more on a biblical perspective, but then also on the history that we have in the Methodist movement on social action. And look forward to seeing you all on Sunday. And we've got one more lesson on community. That'll be next Wednesday. So God bless you. Have a great day.